lawyers to implement it, and the president signed it last night. But this is fully consistent with everything he's always said.
Agree on that. I guess the one criticism that you're going to get when you go face the media, so I might as well put it here, is the order in which you're doing things. Sometimes Mr. Trump is very expressive on the social medias, which is better than, let's say, the previous administration, which just wasn't available and in cognitive decline. So I guess the question of he announces something and then you guys explain it deeper. Is that the optimal way to do this? Should we not worry about it? Should you come out with like more official stuff? I guess that's the move fast, break things that we are used to in Silicon Valley, but that people, whether it's in business, are maybe a little concerned about, that things are maybe different now in the White House and in how we're running our government. Maybe you could expand on that.
Have you ever considered that maybe you just had an overreaction to a tweet?
Well, okay. So if we're going to place the blame on me,
I'm just saying that
I wasn't the only one. The original crypto OGs were like, wait a second, why is he picking these three and not these three? So that made a lot of people, putting myself out of it, like, whoa, what's going on here? Is he picking favorites? And that's, I guess, everybody's big concern. So maybe you could assuage that.
We're not. Yeah, we're not picking favorites, obviously, except I will say this. We do think Bitcoin is special, and I can get into the reasons why.
Explain why. That's a great thing, yeah.
Well, Bitcoin is the original cryptocurrency. It's the first one. It's the only one that doesn't have an issuer, right? It's very decentralized. It's, in crypto, they call this the Immaculate Conception. We don't really know how it got here. We don't know who Satoshi is. It's almost mystical, you would say.
Yes.
It's the most valuable one. It has a $2 trillion market cap, and it's the most secure. It's never been hacked, right? So we're now, over 15 years into this journey, and there's been a lot of people who've been skeptical along the way, and there's been a lot of ups and downs, but here it is. I rember back in 2011, I think it's the first time I bought a Bitcoin. I think it was at $120. Now it's at $90,000. Again, there've been all sorts of wild swings along the way, but this thing just keeps chugging along. And you can think of that $2 trillion market cap as like a $2 trillion bug bounty. If there was a way to hack this, there's every incentive in the world. And by hack, I mean like to double spend, create basically a counterfeit Bitcoin, I guess would be the way for people to think about it. And
it is a miracle it hasn't been compromised. I think we can all say that.
Well, I don't know if it's a miracle. I think it's exceptional design.
Sure.
And so I think what you could say is that it's been tested in a very robust way, and there's been every incentive to basically break the encryption, and it continues to chug along. And so I think the price has gone up as the protocol has gotten more acceptance. And this is another point, is that Bitcoin is the most widely accepted as a store of value throughout the world.
Yeah.
So we do believe it should be treated special. Now, that being said, we're also creating the digital asset stockpile. So all the other digital assets.
Explain the difference between these two. So there's a digital asset stockpile. That's the picker. And then on the other side, there's a strategic reserve for Bitcoin, because we do acquire Bitcoin, we, the United States of America, when we seize from terrorists, criminals, et cetera. We do seize these. And then we often make the mistake of liquidating them when maybe we should be holding them. Yeah. So explain that architecture.
So we have the reserve and we have the stockpile. So the reserve is just Bitcoin. The goal is long-term preservation. Think of it as like a digital Fort Knox for digital gold. We want to put the digital gold in there. We want to keep it secure. We never want to sell it. That's the goal of the reserve. And you're right that we've made the mistake in the past of selling this stuff. At one point in time, we had about 400,000 Bitcoin on the federal balance sheet. We sold roughly half of that for something like $360 million total. If we had held all of that, it would be worth, just that the portion we sold would be worth over 17 billion. So we made this mistake of prematurely selling Bitcoin when we should have held it. We don't want to make that mistake with regard to the rest of it. We think there's around 200,000 coins left on the federal balance sheet, but the truth is that nobody knows because we've never done a proper audit. So part of what this executive order provides is that we're going to do for the first time a government-wide accounting of the digital assets that we actually have. So,
and if digital assets emerge in some department, I don't know, the FBI seizes some, the CIA seizes some, I don't know which organization winds up having them, they're going to be legally required to report that and then put them in the reserve.
Well, they'll be legally required to report it, and then they'll go in the reserve if there's a final adjudication. So, obviously, if those coins could go back as restitution to victims, or if the person who they were seized from wins their court case and gets them back, they're not going to go into the Federal Reserve. But if there's been a final adjudication and a final forfeiture, yes, those will go into the reserve. Anyway, that's Bitcoin. Okay, so then you got the stockpile. Let me just talk about that. So first of all, like I said, we don't know exactly what digital assets the federal government has. I've seen reports that it might have, for example, 50,000 ETH, which is Ethereum. But again, we need to get to the bottom of that. When we figure out exactly what the assets are, we're going to move them into the digital stockpile. The purpose of the stockpile is responsible stewardship. It's a place for safekeeping. It's a centralized, you could say, account under the direction of the Secretary of the Treasury. And the Secretary of the Treasury will figure out how to maximize the values of these holdings. Now, there's a couple of important differences between stockpile and reserve. So one is the reserve, the executive order actually provides that the Secretary of the Treasury will not sell the Bitcoin. Okay, we're prohibited from selling the Bitcoin. There's no such prohibition with respect to the stockpile. If the Secretary of the Treasury decides that it's in the long-term interest of the U.S. to rebalance the portfolio or change the portfolio, the Secretary has the discretion to do that.
Okay, which makes sense because there's a long tail of crypto. We might see something that we don't have the ability to predict the future, and we don't have the staff to sit there and look at these assets every day like a fund manager would and say, what do we do with these? What percentage should it be of the overall stockpile, of the overall holdings? So maybe the decision with Ethereum is, hey, this thing's waning. We just put it into Bitcoin because we know that's the more solid one. Yeah, that's what I'm reading into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely fair. I mean, look, I think that the stockpile should be subject to good portfolio management, right?
Excellent.
Unfortunately, we have a Secretary of the Treasury who is an extremely successful former hedge fund manager. So he's going to figure out the best way to manage these assets. And we give him the flexibility to do portfolio management. Whereas,
and he has to live and die with what he does. He has to make those decisions, and that's going to be, part of how he's evaluated by the president. So hopefully he's going to be sharp about that.
Right, but the reserve is different, right? The reserve is just digital Fort Knox. Now, there's one other important difference between stockpile and reserve. So with respect to reserve, the EO provides that the secretaries that I'm talking about, Treasury and Commerce, they're allowed to figure out strategies to accumulate more Bitcoin for the reserve if those strategies are budget neutral and don't cost the taxpayer anything, okay? So it's possible that we could. I'm not saying that we will, but it authorizes them to acquire more Bitcoin if they can figure out a way to do it that doesn't impact the federal budget or the deficit or taxpayers, right?
Okay, well, I had a very simple suggestion for this, which I'll float up the flag.